So now that I'm at the point where I want to go ahead and start putting in my shadows, I've already gone ahead and put a couple of them in there. I'm going to use a B pencil. If I can find it here. I just had it. Well, I was going to use a B pencil. That's what I used on these. I'm going to go ahead and use an HB since my B is not readily available. What I want to do is go ahead and mark off first. What I did is I put down, I used my eraser as kind of my light source. So my eraser kind of mimics like where the light would be coming from. And then you use your ruler to put in edges. So like on this one, I actually want this to come from the end. I kind of put a little bit in, but if I kind of move this around, you can see where if this is my light source, this is where my shadow lines would be. You wouldn't see the one from this, it'd actually be shadowing this, but we're not gonna show that. So here's this one, and kind of comes forward a little bit. That will help you in figuring out where your shadow lines are from. You know, the taller you make it up here, the more it's gonna come forward. So if you kind of pretend it's like over here, then it would shoot to this side more. So when you're doing a shadow, you have a couple different, you know, we call it a drop shadow and a cast shadow. So this really dark area right underneath the shape, the form, excuse me, that is called the drop. And it's the darkest part in anything. So on all of these, the darkest area should be this. So, you know, if I really want to accentuate it, I could come in with my 6B and really make it obvious that that's the drop shadow. Then it feathers out really quickly, and that's what we call the cast shadow, and it kind of fades out because it's casted. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that on this cube. So I'm going to go all the way across. I got into my shape, so my form, I'm going to erase that out. And come back underneath it. And I'm going to hold my pencil to the side, so I'm using more of the longer part, and I'm just going to feather that out. Just a little bit. This I think would be more like that. Showing up a little bit on that side. I'm going to switch to a 2B because that's a 2. Because I think I need it to be a little bit darker. Again, I used a B for these, and I think that works really well. I'm just kind of making it dark and then fading it out. And again, I'm going to come in with that 6B right up underneath here and very, very carefully just do a solid dark black line because that's my drop shadow. And it's not very big. And then I'm going to come in with my Q-tip and I'm going to blend it. I'm going to do it a little on this side too. And I want to rub it in multiple directions so that I get more of a blend and less of a grainy look. And again, I'm going to do that here. I'm going to turn this a little bit. Just come right underneath the shape. And it kind of blends out. This is my 6B. I think I'll do this one in the whole thing just to kind of show you the difference. You know, the darker you make your shadows, the more prominent the light source is. So if I have like really deep dark shadows, it means that I had a really hard light. So it was really, really bright. Whereas if I want it more daylighty, you know, it fades a little bit better. Finger there. So again, this was a 6B, this was a 2B, this is a regular B, but either way they all kind of fade out. I'm gonna come back in and get rid of that. use my eraser to touch up my shadow areas. So there's my shadows. So this is where I want you to take a picture, because you know, this is where you've shown me your drawing part, your ability to render and add the pattern. And now we're gonna have some fun playing around with color. But I want you to take a picture of this point, because when you're playing around with the color, you may or may not have used watercolor or color pencil before. And if you're gonna make a mistake, the next step is where that would be. But I want you to experiment and practice. So I want you to take a picture of it now, because I can see the drawing and everything like that. So you'll submit a drawing of it now, and then another one at the very, very end. So I'm going to show you guys with watercolor. Now this isn't watercolor paper, so it's going to absorb a little differently. And what I would recommend is, I've given you a lot of paper and you have different sizes of pieces. You can take an extra and you can practice on it. I'm just going to go for it. I've got my cup of water. I've got my brush here that came with the watercolors. You guys have a set of brushes you can use that are going to be a little bit finer. First thing I'm going to do is get it wet. And I'm going to start with this square. So I'm going to do what's called wet on wet, where I want to really control where my watercolor is going. So I'm painting in just the part I want the watercolor to hit. So I'm going over this white section and just a little bit into the gray. And then I'm going to pick the green. Okay, so I'm going to dip into the water and get my green, and I'm going to set it over here on this because I want to make sure that I can kind of water it down a little bit. So I'm just going to put it in here, and I can see how light or how dark the watercolor is. And just kind of place it where I want it to go and blend it in. Then I'm going to dip a little bit more green because I want it darkest at the corner. Now as you see, it kind of spreads out there, because I want it to go from dark to light. So I can spread it all the way down now that I've got my color, and see how that goes. If I don't like this, or if I make a mistake, I can come in with watercolor and just tap it and lift, and you see it, like, it's called blotting. It lifts the color out. Come in a little bit more. I really want that green to show up in the corner. So I'm gonna let that sit, and then I'm gonna come in down here. Now I'm gonna show you, this is called wet on dry. So I wanna make sure I've got the right color green, not too dark, not too light. This is where if I had a side piece of paper, I could test it. And I'm gonna come through, so when the paper's dry and my my paintbrush is wet, it's a little bit different. It will only stay where I put it. So I can get really dark, but it doesn't necessarily spread out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dip my brush in the water and kind of clear that a little bit and kind of blend it down. And kind of blend it into there. So you can kind of see the difference between wet on wet and dry. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. When you make a mistake and it's dry like this, like let's say I made a mistake, it doesn't blot as well as if there was a lot of extra water. That has to do more with the water. And I'm just very careful. I'm gonna come into my corners, bring this down, and I don't want it sopping wet. Come about halfway. I'm gonna rinse my brush out a little bit so it's just plain water. Put some water on there and kind of blend it in. You kind of are practicing. So this is where I'm saying, like, the reason I wanted you to go ahead and take a picture before you added any color is in case you make a mistake at this point. I don't want you to feel like your drawing's ruined. In design arts, this is an entry-level class, so I don't expect you to know how to do any of this. You may not have touched watercolors since 5th grade. But I do want you to experiment, and that's why we take the picture. So I go through, and again, I'm doing dry right now. Put that in, get my brush wet so it's almost completely water, and now I'm kind of blending it back and forth so it'll blend down. I'm gonna take this, I think, kind of blot it there at the corner. Now, if I want it to be darker, I would do layering. I wouldn't go right into this right now. I would wait till it's dried a little bit. That way I can layer on top and on top. The other thing is, if I'm doing this shape, I want the whole thing to be green. So I'm gonna do wet on wet again down here. Get some green, kind of tap it out. Put it in there. It's kind of too dark, so I'm gonna tap it down. Do it again. Now you can go back and forth like this if you want. The only reason that I suggest you do one at a time though is you have more control, and then you can kind of get each one perfect before you move on to the next, because as the water's sitting here, it's seeping into the paper. Just want a little bit of green to show up there. And again, you can do wet on wet. Put some more water over here. I would not recommend, like I just have my water over here to the left and I spilled. If you're right-handed, keep your water and your paint to the right. You could even lay a paper towel, like I could put something down here so that if I accidentally get a drip, it doesn't drip onto my paper. Now again, if you're fast and you have this, you can blot it. But again, I'm just kind of coming in and very carefully putting it where I want it to go. Now, if you notice when I first put it down, it's obviously a lot darker, but I've been dipping into the water, coming back in and kind of diluting it. I want it to be kind of even. Put a little green back up into there. So I'm gonna go through and do this to the whole shape, let it dry, and then show you how to make it darker.